One of the hardest things a sitcom can pull off is replacing an established actor. After watching somebody play a character for years and years, it's hard to imagine anybody else in the role. Eventually, it just feels like the actor is the character. So historically, whenever a show suddenly swaps somebody out with a different actor, audiences usually don't take it very well. And one of the most famous examples of that is Becky from Roseanne. For the first 5 seasons, Becky Connor was played by Lisa Goranson, and then in season 6, starting with the homecoming episode, she was replaced by Sarah Chalke for a portion of time. And anytime sitcom recasts get brought up, this is usually one of the first examples that people will talk about. You know, the topic has always been pretty polarizing, but after going back and rewatching the show again, I don't actually think the recast itself was the problem here. I actually think the show handled that part pretty well. You know, with Lisa Goranson, she left because she was going to college, and you know, that's a completely understandable reason to leave the show. So with that being said, let's talk about the real problem people have with the Becky recast. Alright, so to understand why this switch feels so drastic, you gotta remember who the original Becky was here. And if you're a huge Roseanne fan, then you already know exactly what I'm talking about. Becky was one of the most fully realized characters on the show. You know, out of all the kids, Becky was probably the most like Roseanne, which is exactly why they fought so much. You know, she had the same stubbornness and had the same sarcasm, the same willingness to say exactly what she was thinking no matter who was standing in front of her. Becky has some of the most brutal lines in the entire series. You know, I always think about the 2-part episode Terms of Estrangement, when she basically tells Dan to his face that he's the reason the family never gets ahead. He's the reason she's not going to be able to go to college. He can't run a business, and that's the reason why Mark doesn't have a job.
You know, you act like you're the only ones with problems around here. You have any idea what I'm going through? Today may be the last day I'll ever see Mark again, okay? Job offer in Minneapolis, and I'm telling him to take it. And it's all because of you. If you knew how to run a business, he'd still have a job and he wouldn't be leaving. Now I don't have Mark, I don't have college, I don't have anything. You blew it, Dad. You blew it for everyone in this family. Becky, you shut up.
It's probably one of the most brutal scenes in the entire series, and I always like tense up watching it. I mean, it is an insane scene, but it also perfectly captures who Becky is and how much emotional weight she carries. And the thing is with her, you know, she was never portrayed as this clueless, dumb character. You know, when she argued with Roseanne, you could usually understand where she was coming from. She was still too young to take a step back and see the big picture. She was very selfish, but she wasn't dumb at all. You know, she was a very smart character that cared about school and had big goals, had a lot of ambition. In fact, that's why her storyline with Mark is one of the most compelling in sitcom history, because Becky running away and getting married is shocking because she wasn't the kid you expected to do that. She seemed like the one who was gonna break this cycle of being a poor white trash family. And again, that's what makes that storyline hit so hard. You know, you're watching somebody that is portrayed with this unlimited potential in the early parts of the show slowly make decisions that just completely derail her future. And you know, nobody in the audience wants Becky to fail, but that's what makes it so painful and realistic, because everybody knows the person like Becky. And again, that's what gives her so much emotional weight. So anyways, eventually Lisa leaves the show to go pursue academics. Becky on the show gets married to Mark and moves away, and the show continues on. And eventually Roseanne decides to bring Becky back in season 6, and on paper it sounded like it should have worked. You know, Sarah Chalke had the look, she had the acting ability. The problem is that the Becky that comes back into the show just does not feel like the one that left. And the best way that I can explain that is, it's kind of like the writers remembered Becky's attitude, but they forgot what motivated her attitude. You know what I mean? The original Becky argued and complained and made a ton of mistakes, but there was always something underneath those reactions. You know, her frustration came from a place of honesty. Her anger came from a place of realness. There was always a real conflict that was driving her emotions. And with Sarah Chalke's Becky, it often feels like only the surface level predictable traits of the original remain. You know, she gets mad and she argues and she storms out of every scene that she's in, and that basically becomes her character. And you know, for me, once I started to notice that, it was just impossible to stop noticing. I mean, seriously, every time Sarah Chalke walks into a scene, I'm sitting there like, okay, let's start the timer and see how fast it takes for her to storm out of the scene, because it just happens constantly with her. Somebody will say something she doesn't like, she will react and say something crazy and then get angry and storm out and whatever. It genuinely just becomes this thing that you just can't not notice, you know. And another thing is, one of the biggest differences between these two versions is the perception of their intelligence. You know, the original Becky was portrayed as this smart teenager who made immature decisions. With the new version of Becky, it often feels like she's just written as an immature person, period. You know, which is fine. I understand that. She's still very young when she's portrayed by Sarah Chalke. Totally understandable that she would be immature. But I think the huge distinction here is that with Lacey Goranson, it's a layered character making mistakes, while Sarah Chalke's is just kind of stripped away of the intelligence and the ambition, and that version of her just stops feeling relatable and feels more irritating to watch. And more than anything, I think that she just loses the emotional weight. You know, with the original Becky generating a lot of conflict and genuine conflict, I think Sarah Chalke's Becky often creates conflicts out of the smallest little things, or is more reactionary to other people's conflicts, while Lacey Goranson's Becky felt like somebody whose entire life was just unfolding right in front of us as the show was going on, versus Sarah Chalke's Becky just feeling like she's just in the scene that she's in to drive the plot. You know, again, it breaks the immersion for me and all that type of stuff. The character just feels smaller, less layered, less dynamic, and it just feels like a huge downgrade overall. And again, not because of the actor. I definitely don't want to make it seem like I'm blaming Sarah Chalke in any way, because I'm not. Whenever a recast doesn't work, I feel like people usually like to hate or blame the actor. And I do want to say, sometimes I think it's fair to blame the actor if the actor is at fault, but I don't think that is the case in this situation. Sarah Chalke was just playing the version of Becky that she was told to play. She was saying the lines that she was given. She was making the choices that the writers had her character make, and an actor can only do so much with the material they're given. You know, obviously she's an extremely talented actress, so I'm not taking anything away from her. Obviously she's had a huge successful career. The issue was not Sarah Chalke. The issue was the writing, because when you're replacing somebody after 5 seasons, audiences aren't just asking if they're gonna like the new actor, you know what I mean? They're not just excited about that. They're gonna be putting that actor under a microscope and asking the question of, does this feel like the same person? And for most viewers, at least in my experience, the people that I've talked to, it seems like it didn't feel the same for most people. What's funny though is that the show actually understood this too. You know, even in real time, the show constantly made jokes about having the two Beckys. You know, they broke the fourth wall, they poked fun at the recast.
I cannot believe that they replaced that Darren.
Well, I like the second Darren much better.
And you know, a lot of those jokes are actually really hilarious. I love the self-awareness and kind of the meta jokes. But while they're doing this, they're also highlighting the problem, because even the show recognizes, and they're admitting that they recognize, that these feel like different characters in a sense. I feel like the only thing that they draw similarities to is the appearance. But either way, I think all in all here is the Becky recast one of the worst recasts of all time? Honestly, no, not even close in my opinion. I feel like there is way worse ones out there, which we will be talking about in other videos. But again, the problem wasn't Sarah Chalke here, and it wasn't the decision to make a recast. It was, actors leave, shows adapt, all that stuff is kind of normal. You know what I mean? You see it a lot in other things. The real problem is that somewhere along the way, the show writers stopped writing Becky like Becky. Whether it was intentional or not, they ended up creating two completely different versions of the same character that have left people debating all these years later.